Welcome back. Welcome. If it's your first time joining us, great. You can silence your cell phones. I'm grateful to be with you. We're going to take just a kind of like a moment's deep breath to orient ourselves to being in sacred time and sacred space. Just you can take the call outside if you need to. Otherwise, we'll silence our cell phones, and let's actually hold a moment of silence, recognizing that the prompting circumstance for being together as a community to learn, to study, to explore, to bring heavy hearts, to ask hard questions, was all prompted by an unprovoked massacre of Israelis on October 7th. It's fortunate that the number has been revised downward somewhat since last week. Israel now has identified 1,200 victims of the massacre as opposed to 1,400, which was the statistic previously reported. It's still an ongoing nightmare. To call this Israel's 9/11 is not actually an understatement. In some ways, the impact on Israeli life, Israeli identity, and surely on Jewish history will be even greater than 9/11 on American history and American people. So let's take a moment just to hold our silence in remembrance of those who were slain, and also to hold in our hearts a prayer for a swift, just, and peaceful outcome to the war. Take a moment. Ti zichronam baruch, may those who have died bring blessing through memory. Welcome back. And to those who are streaming or watching the recording of the class online, welcome to you as well. I'm Jonathan Blake. I serve as the Senior Rabbi of Westchester Reformed Temple. My role as a teacher of history is one that comes about through a love of study, a love of learning, and a sense that it's among my foremost responsibilities and privileges to help share my love of learning with Jewish communities. And so whether you are a member of Westchester Reformed Temple, a friend of a member, or just a guest who happens to be tuning in either in person or remotely, please know how welcome you are and how grateful I feel for the fact that the size of our class is even larger this week than last week. So if word is getting around that this is a worthwhile way to spend 90 minutes of your week, then I'm so grateful. And I hope that this will prove a meaningful time together. Let me just silence the, thank you. So I realized this past week I kind of had like an anxious moment of reckoning with myself about the overly ambitious intention to teach the history of Zionism and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in effectively 4 sessions plus 1, where the last session I won't be here, but Cantor Kleinman will be here to explore the conflict through Jewish music, which is, of course, very much her wheelhouse, but also, I think, really relevant to have multiple lenses through which to explore Israeli-Palestinian history. So our first session, in case you missed it, and also for those who were here, was an exploration of the roots of Zionism. And I'm just going to do a little bit of summary, and I've decided that the best way for me to get through all of the history I want to in 4 sessions is to speak fast. So I'm going to do my best. We may not have a lot of time for discursive questions, conversations, and rabbit holes, only because my intention today is to get us through about 40 years of history, from World War I through the War of Independence. So that's an ambitious agenda. So let me begin with just a brief summary of what we tried to do at our first session. After an open-ended exploratory conversation at the beginning of class, which as an educator I call the set induction. It's sort of like if you ever take a yoga class and the teacher sits at the front and says, before we start moving our bodies around, I want to set an intention, right? So asking the question, what is Zionism, at the outset of last week's class, set an intention for the rest of our study, which was namely to explore the roots of the Zionist movement or movements. And I said it is more accurate to talk about Zionisms than Zionism, presenting the truth that Zionism was actually many visions and conversations that were taking place around the same issue, which was identified at the time in the latter part of the 19th century in Europe as the Jewish question. In other words, what to do with Europe's Jews. Zionism is a response to intractable European anti-Semitism. And so some of the features that I identified and we talked about last week include these: violence against Jewish communities, not only by unorganized mobs, but variously and at times with the approval and even sponsorship of state actors, local militias, police and other law enforcement units, all combining in Jewish experience over the course of many, many decades. Not only in the 19th century, we did a little bit of exploration how a lot of this has medieval precedent going back hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years of sporadic violence against Jewish communities, often based on notorious lies like the blood libel that charges Jews with kidnapping and murdering Christian children to use their blood for ritual purposes like making matzah. If it sounds outlandish to you, it is. And that has not actually stopped it from being one of the most widespread and destructive lies about the Jewish people ever communicated. 2, betrayal of what Jews thought would be the promise of enlightenment. So we talked about this last week, that both the emancipation of Jews from the ghettos, which was part of the Napoleonic conquest of Western Europe, but also the vast array, the kind of perfect storm of social, political, intellectual, and cultural upheaval that is known in the West as the Enlightenment, or in Hebrew as the Haskalah, at least referring to the intellectual currents that were accompanying Jews coming out of the ghettos and being welcomed, at least in theory or on paper, as fully participatory members of modern society. What began as the bright promise of enlightenment by the middle of the 19th century and into the latter decades of the 1800s proved to be a kind of false promise, resulting in widespread Jewish disillusionment that they would ever truly be welcomed as equals among Gentiles in most Western European countries, and certainly in the East, where Enlightenment did not reach, right? Your ancestors who came from places like Romania and Hungary and Russia, or the Russian Empire, where Jews were living in a restricted, almost like Iron Curtain of land, partitioned off from the rest of Western Europe, called the Pale of Settlement. Anyone ever hear of the Pale of Settlement? Pale comes from, by the way, the Latin root palus, P-A-L-U-S, which means a stake, like an S-T-A-K-E in the ground. You know this word from words like impale. To impale someone, right, means to, penetrate them with a stake. So the word Pale of Settlement means a staked off area. Right? Imagine just an area that's literally fenced off. That becomes the restricted area for Jews to live in the Pale of Settlement. So most of our Eastern European ancestors are sometimes described as having come from the Pale of Settlement. Many of them had never been touched by the democratizing, equalizing forces of the Enlightenment to begin with. Thirdly, the disillusionment of European Jewry that Europe would ever become a hospitable home for Jewish people becomes widespread as news of pogroms and anti-Semitic discrimination and boycotting of Jewish businesses becomes mainstreamed in the latter part, or I should say re-mainstreamed, despite the promise of enlightenment, in the latter part of the 19th century. And ongoing oppression and marginalization and hostility against Jews under the Tsarist rule in the Pale. Right? So you have all of these forces that produce a certain kind of revitalized spirit of we have to do something about this. So we talked about different Zionisms closer to the end of last week's session. And without going into the different Zionisms, if you took the handout, if you want to read more, we talked about main strands of Zionism. You have the Zionism as articulated and promoted by Herzl, which is political Zionism. The thrust being, we need a new political reality for the Jews, namely a state, to be established in our ancestral homeland, which is at the time known as Palestine. It is under the Ottoman rule, the rule of the Ottoman Empire, which is where our story will begin when we pick up with today's new learning, eventually it will be under the governance of the British colonial empire, known as British Mandatory Palestine, meaning the British have a mandate to govern that is internationally recognized in the territory called Palestine. We're gonna start with that today. So Herzl seeks a political reality and convenes the first Zionist Congress in 1897 with delegates from all over European Jewry, representing the varied but consistent interests of the Jewish people of Europe to come up with a viable and permanent solution to the Jewish question, what to do with Europe's Jews in a situation and a place that is no longer viable for the safety of European Jewry. Some early Zionists were not only focused on physical safety and the creation of a political reality, but also revitalizing the spirit of Judaism. The main architect of this viewpoint is an author named Achad Ha'am. It's a taken name. It wasn't his real name. A lot of these guys took new names, by the way, as they signaled that they were being reborn into a new and revitalized Jewish identity. So they shed the names that signaled that they were part of Europe's old school, old country Jewry, and they took names in Hebrew as if to say, we're not just revitalizing opportunity for Jews to live in a new place, we're also going to revitalize Judaism. So a lot of this is prompted by a sense that even as Jews were dying, so too was Judaism a dead or dying thing. The way I would put it is, Jews began to realize that in many cases throughout Europe, you can take the Jew out of the ghetto, but you can't take the ghetto out of the Jew. After generations, centuries even, of ghetto living, the idea that we would think of ourselves as weak, as unequal to Western European Gentiles, was deeply inbred within the soul of Jewish people and Judaism as a whole. So some of the early Zionists were equally, if not more, focused on actually coming up with a new spiritual revitalization of Judaism, which they believed, even without a political reality on the ground, was both desirable and necessary if Judaism was to remain alive past the 19th century. We also talked about religious Zionism, very briefly. We touched on it at the end, as exemplified by Harav Avraham Yitzchak Kook, who basically said there can be no revitalization of the Jewish people, and a political reality in Palestine will be meaningless without a Jewish religious consciousness that animates all of it. Without Judaism as a living, practiced faith, all of this is meaningless. That is religious Zionism. And then finally, we have the Zionism as promoted and practiced by people like Aleph Dalet Gordon, Aharon David Gordon, who was a sickly, weak, yeshiva-ish student who emigrates to Palestine, never having picked up an implement of labor in his life, but grabs a pickaxe and a shovel and basically says, the only way we will revitalize Judaism is by taking the soil of Eretz Yisrael into our own hands and transforming the land. And all of these Zionisms exist and coexist, at times comfortably, at times they reinforce one another, at times they are in competition with one another, as exemplified by probably the biggest debate facing the early Zionists, and we talked about this last week, which is, where should we go? It was intuitively obvious to some, and eventually to Herzl, that the only viable option was Palestine, largely because of the Jewish indigenous connection to the land, the Jewish spiritual connection to the land, the fact that for almost 2,000 years, Jews had not stopped praying 3 times a day for a return to that place, and yet others who said, that is a risky move. First of all, it's controlled by the Ottomans, and we have a tenuous relationship with the Ottomans and with the Sultan. Wouldn't it be better to go somewhere where we maybe have friendlier relations, like the British? The Commonwealth had colonies all over the world. Uganda was proposed. And it actually really tore apart the early Zionists. By the Second Zionist Congress, Herzl was distraught. He was beside himself, seeing that his movement might fail because of internecine conflict over where to go. And eventually, he sides with the Palestine movement against the Uganda movement, which is eventually put down and put aside so that the movement can coalesce around the idea of returning to Palestine. That, in 10 minutes, is what I hoped we got through last week. Today, my goal is even more ambitious, which is to take us basically from right around World War I to the end of the War for Independence in 1949. So that is a more than 40-year stretch of history. So if there are any questions about what we've covered so far, ask them now, and then we'll move forward. Tons of questions, I'm sure. You're more or less with me? And I realize like anything I'm doing has to just skirt over all the good stuff. I'm going to try not to do that. I'm going to try to illustrate with colorful anecdotes and introduce you to amazing people who were part of this revolution. But along the way, if you really want to deep dive, I said this last week in case you missed it, the book that I'm rereading right now that I think is really just the single best summary of all of Israeli history is called Israel, A Concise History of a Nation Reborn by Daniel Gordis, who also has a fantastic Substack, which is a subscription-only daily newsletter. He publishes it 5 times a week. It is my lifeline to what's really happening in Israel. And by the way, it is not jingoistic or, it is not totally biased. I mean, it's a view from an Israeli with a deep understanding of Israel and compassion for the situation of Israel. Nevertheless, I think he really speaks a lot of truth and has a very nuanced worldview. And every day there's a new piece of content. Sometimes it's like, hey, you should watch this news broadcast and I'll translate it for you. And he does that. He puts subtitles in for things that most American audiences would never have easy access to. Or here's a video that's going viral in Israel right now. Let's watch it and talk about it. And you can usually read what he has to say in 10 minutes. I have found him invaluable as a resource for more than a year now. I've been reading him every day since the democracy protests began at around this time of year last year. So that's when I got tuned onto Gordis's Substack. And he also has a weekly podcast. But anyway, look up Daniel Gordis and go to his website, subscribe to his Substack. You have to pay for it. It's worth every cent. Or get somebody you love to give it to you for Hanukkah. It's just great. Give it to your friends for Hanukkah. It's like my big Hanukkah gift this year. I think it's $77 a year, something like that. It's worth every cent. Okay, yes, Jay, and then I saw Gary's hand. Great, they have this book at Bronx River Books. Support your local bookseller. Support your local bookseller. Love that. Gary.
So, in the origins of Zionism, you were talking about the European Jews who felt they didn't have a home. Did you mention whether there was interest among the Middle Eastern Jews?
I did not mention, and the answer is because the answer is not really. Not really. Now, we're going to see that Middle Eastern Jewry, or what is called in Hebrew the Mizrahim, often mistakenly identified, much to their disapproval, as Sephardim. The majority of Jews who come from the Middle East in the 20th century no longer view themselves as Sephardic, even if their distant ancestors came from the expelled communities of the Iberian Peninsula. Sfarad is the Hebrew word for Spain. So Jews from Spain and Portugal and the colonies and principalities established under Spanish rule are Sephardic. And many of them, after expulsion in 1492 and the century that followed, did make their way to populate communities in North Africa and throughout the Ottoman Empire. But by the time we get to, the origins of Zionism as a movement in the late 19th century, it's really a distinctly European phenomenon. And some of that is actually because, this may come as a surprise, Jews who found themselves resident in Arab lands or in Muslim majority lands or even under Muslim rule in the early part of the 20th century were better off by considerable margins than the Jews of Europe who for centuries had lived under Christian rule. And there are stark contrasts. If you look at how Jews fared in Spain from the 8th century all the way up to, say, the 12th century, what is known as the Golden Age of Spain. It's called the Golden Age not because Jews were like raking in dough, but because it was a time of relative cultural and strong cultural and literary prosperity, artistic prosperity, and then also a more hands-off approach to Spain's Jews, right? They were kind of allowed to have their Jewish practices and traditions without strict government control or subjugation. Again, it's all relative. We talked about this a little bit. Whereas, in Spanish-controlled and then what would become Muslim-controlled lands, Jews were dhimmi, which means a people of the book, a respected second-class citizen. And depending on when and who exactly, more or less respected. Always second-class citizen, but much better than in much of Christian Europe, where Jews were at times, we're going back even before the Crusades, which were in the 11th century. Jews were often existing at peril to their life and livelihood, and all sorts of restricted legislation. You can't marry a Christian, you can't have Christians in your home as servants, you can't become an artisan in a guild, those were all restricted to Jews, you can't own land. So Jews became tavern owners, moneylenders, involved in professions that were considered to be either seedy or worse, really ignoble professions. So the history of Jews and money is largely a response to discrimination throughout medieval Christendom. I know a lot about this because this was my area of focus as a rabbinical student. I studied basically Jews in medieval Christian lands. Everyone agrees it was better to be a Jew in Muslim lands than it was to be a Jew in Christian lands for most of our history. That changes in the 20th century. It changes, though, after Israel declares its independence. So I'm not saying that Jews had it great in places like Iran and Iraq and Syria, but there were huge Jewish communities in these places, many of which had existed for hundreds of years in relative peace, stability, and without a whole lot of government molestation. They were not subject to violent pogroms and widespread anti-Semitism. We're going to learn this today, but Nazi-style anti-Semitic propaganda comes to the Middle East by way of the Nazis during World War II. It's really amazing that the Middle East, in other words, does not have the same indigenous traditions of Jew hatred that the Muslim world did. It's adopted. It's an import, and it's a virulent import that now, in my view, is the most significant existential threat to Jewish people. If there are three different kinds of anti-Semitism today, there's leftist anti-Semitism, there's far-right anti-Semitism, and then there's jihadist anti-Semitism. They're all, of course, related. They're brothers or cousins to one another. But the latest, even if it is the most virulent, chronologically speaking, is jihadist anti-Semitism. Isn't really a thing until the 1940s. Okay, so there just isn't a motivation to mass emigrate to Palestine if you're living in Baghdad. Until there is. Until 1948, really. Yeah.
In today's summer, you talked about the Jews focused on the Zionist Congress about getting back to Palestine. In large part, it sounds like the disillusionment of not being fully accepted in various ways in Europe. But last week, you also mentioned the rise in anti-Semitism over the course of it. And I tried to do a little research on myself. Is there a very brief summary or a couple major points of some anti-Semitic movements or actions that really inspired you?
Yeah, I'll give three. One, I forget his name, but I have it somewhere in my notes. A prominent German intellectual that came across a pamphlet that he had written, came across Herzl's desk. Remember, Herzl is an up-and-coming bourgeois, adopted Viennese Jewish journalist, born in Pest, which will later become part of Budapest. He's Hungarian by birth, but really raised in the high culture of Vienna. He reads this pamphlet, I think, in the 1880s, and is absolutely horrified. Remember, Herzl at the time is a man of 23. Herzl was born in 1860. So he's reading this literature, and he basically says, if this is what is being produced by the highest regarded intellectuals of German society, we're in trouble. That's one. So there's literature. Two, he's dispatched to cover the trial of a French lieutenant named Alfred Dreyfus. And the Dreyfus affair, which you can look up on your own, is like the test case par excellence of anti-Semitism in action. And then thirdly, the Kishinev pogrom of 1903, which saw the brutal murder of Jews in their homes of a kind that we had not been familiar with on October 6th in our lifetimes. And then we saw it on October 7th, like that, without guns, but with axes and pitchforks and burning people alive and cutting out babies out of the womb in front of their living mother, like horrific things that the Jewish people wrote about, and that Chaim Nachman Bialik, who would go on to become like the poet laureate of the Yishuv, which is the Zionist settlement in pre-state Palestine, in pre-Israel Palestine, he will document in his epic poem, The City of Slaughter, the Be'ir HaHarega. Okay, so let's pick up actually at the first Zionist Congress. It's 1897. And what I want to use this as is the example of what we're really talking about today. Is if last week we talked about the intellectual underpinnings of the Zionist movement, then the question becomes, so how do we actually do it? How do we take what we believe and build a Jewish state in Palestine? And so at the first Zionist Congress, which is convened at the very end of August in 1897, the delegates come up with a platform that identifies the following methods to achieve their goals. 1, by fostering the settlement of Palestine with farmers, laborers, and artisans. So in other words, we need not just any people. We can't just have a state if we send all of our intellectual writers and authors over there. Like, that's nice, but that won't build a state. 2, by organizing all of world Jewry in suitable local and general bodies in accordance with the laws of their respective countries. In other words, we need support from Jews wherever they are. Even if they're not going to mass emigrate from Iraq or, Iran, we need their support to do this. 3, by strengthening the national Jewish feeling and national consciousness. Remember that this really is a response to a broader European trend of nationalism, that individual national sentiment was very much on the rise in the latter decades of the 19th century, and Herzl and his compatriots wanted to harness that to help Jews understand themselves, not as a religion so much, but to go back to our roots as a people, which is why last week that's where we began. Some early Zionist or pre-Zionist writings that said the essence of being a Jew is not what you believe or not what you practice in shul or not what you read. It's your sense of identity as part of a collective, a people. And to transform that into the case to be made was all other peoples who see themselves as peoples, whether defined by religion or ethnicity or provenance or language, they all have their own states. They all have their own nations. We require one as well. So to harness the trend of nationalism in the interests of establishing a Zionist polity in Palestine. 4, by taking preparatory steps to attain any governmental consent which may be necessary to reach the aim of Zionism. In other words, we have to have good relations with whoever is governing the territory where we want to establish our state. And finally, they proposed this at the first Congress, not as part of their official plank. It was a separate motion that was approved at the Congress to establish a Jewish national fund to purchase and develop land from the Ottoman Empire. So if you've ever heard of the Jewish National Fund, that is a direct result of a resolution from 1897, August 29th and following. Right? They said, we need money, and so massive Jewish philanthropy was funneled toward purchasing land from the stewards of the land at the time, who were the Ottomans, right? So through direct, and as I said last week, the Ottomans have kind of a mixed relationship with the Jews. On the one hand, they know that the land is populated by probably a few 100,000 Arabs who weren't necessarily like the Ottomans. They weren't Turks. They didn't speak Turkish. They spoke Arabic, and they derived from various Arabian tribes, and they probably had an identity of being Arabs in Palestine, since some of them had lived in this territory called Palestine for generations, if not centuries. So Palestinian Arabs, they are loyal to the Sultan because, of course, it was an autocracy. And the Sultan, based in Istanbul, the Ottomans had all military and administrative jurisdiction over this territory. So you got to deal with the Ottomans if you want to buy land from them. And at times, the Ottomans are more favoring the Arabs, who are indigenous or native in the land. Indigenous is a very problematic word, but they have been in the land for a long time. It's not like there were no people in the land. That's a really unhelpful myth that some pro-Israel people want to stick to. It's like, well, the Zionists came and they just found this, desert and there was no one there and we drained the swamps. No, there were lots of people there. And they were working as laborers and farmers and villagers and shopkeepers and what have you. And to the European Jews, and we talked about this last time, it was easy to look down their noses at these people as kind of primitives or even savages or uneducated and all sorts of other disparaging comments about the Arabs who were already living in the land. So the Ottomans at times actually restricted Jewish land purchase. Nevertheless, they did not restrict it so much that the Jews couldn't get their foothold through legal purchase of the land. And the most famous example was Baron Edmund de Rothschild, the great Jewish benefactor or philanthropist who spent upwards of $6 million of his own fortune, about $150 million in today's money, to purchase about 200 square miles of land and establish about 40 Jewish villages for the Zionist settlers, mostly in the north, mostly agricultural collectives, which will later be known as kibbutzim and moshavim. And we don't need to get into the difference. We're going to really focus on the conflict between Jews and Arabs today. Secondly, following the Congress, immigration to Palestine is encouraged. And this is the era of the chalutzim, or the early pioneers. They established the first agricultural collective. We think of it as a kibbutz. It didn't actually call itself a kibbutz. In the community of Degania, right on the shores of the Galilee. Many of the famous early pioneers are buried there, including the great poetess Rachel Blaustein, and Nomi Shemer, who wrote Yerushalayim Shel Zahav, and a number of other songs that have seared themselves into the Israeli national consciousness, which Cantor Kleinman will be very happy to share with us. They established their own first Jewish self-defense organization, and they established the first Jewish city in Palestine in 1909. And that, of course, is Tel Aviv. And the name is a winking shout-out to Theodor Herzl, who had died 5 years earlier, in 1904. Herzl dies at 44. He lives to see the first few Zionist congresses, and his last public statement is that I may not live to see it. It may take 5 years, it may even take 50 years, but there will be a Zionist state. Well, he's really prescient in so many ways, chiefly in his vision that established a Jewish state in the land of in what was then Palestine, in Eretz Yisrael. And so Tel Aviv means an archaeological mound with different layers. A tel, even today, is like when you see these grassy knolls and hills in Israel, many of them are actually ancient civilizational settlements built up one on top of the other. The further down you go, the older you go. So a tel is something very old, and Aviv means springtime. So the literal translation of Tel Aviv is like Spring Hill. It's a nice name, but it means something. It was a play on the last full-length book that Herzl wrote, which was a German utopian novella called Alt Neuland, which means the old new land. Right? He wanted to build something new in this ancient place. So Tel Aviv, you have the old and the new, and it's a nod to Herzl. It's a way of honoring him. They also strenuously endeavored to revive the Hebrew language. This is mostly the work of one person, a guy who names himself Eliezer ben Yehuda. Who knows what his European name was? Something, very Jewish and Polish, but he takes a Hebrew name. And basically, he and his wife and his kids single-handedly commit to speaking only Hebrew, which is not a thing that was done. Hebrew was a language of scholarship and prayer. It was not a spoken language. And Eliezer ben Yehuda basically inculcated within the earliest Zionist settlement communities the notion that you must speak Hebrew and only Hebrew. And they have these little schoolrooms, and you can even see this, where you can see the Aleph Bet at the front of the room. And apparently it was enforced like with corporal punishment. Like if you were caught speaking any of your native languages, Polish or Hungarian or Romanian or Russian or Yiddish especially, they would slap you on the wrist and insist that you speak Hebrew and only Hebrew. So you have a generation of kids growing up in the yeshuv, which is just the word that means the settlement. It's the name that Jewish people gave to the community of Zionists who were immigrating to Palestine, the yeshuv. And the yeshuv starts to become a political entity with all of the things that a real state will eventually need: self-defense, an economy, infrastructure, leadership, a militia, all of those things. And language, a language to unify the people. And then finally, how to create a political reality. And this is where we get back to the objectives of the Congress, right? The only way to do this is you have to do business with the people who are in charge at the time. So as we are lurching toward World War I in Europe, which of course spreads into the Middle East because one of the main players in the war is the Ottoman Empire, the British and the French, who are, let's just call them from our Western perspective, protagonists in World War I, against the Germans and the Ottomans, and I'm really oversimplifying here, the British and the French start to meet as early as 1915. Remember, the war goes from 1913, 1914 to 1917, 1918, right? The British and the French start to meet, and they decide the Ottoman Empire is crumbling. There is no way that they are going to be victors in this war. We need to carve up their territory for us. And so a delegation is formed, headed on the British side by a guy named Sykes, S-Y-K-E-S, and on the French side by a guy named Picot. They have first names. I wrote it down here somewhere. Yes, Sir Mark Sykes and François-Georges Picot. They agree. They literally take maps and they start doing this with the maps. If you ever look at a map of the Middle East and wonder, what the hell with all of the right angles and straight lines? Right angles and straight lines make for very bad national borders, because you know that they were arbitrarily drawn by people sitting in a room who probably had no actual personal investment in the territory that they're carving up. So it doesn't matter, for instance, that the Kurds are over here and people who consider themselves indigenous Iraqi or Arabs are over here. We'll just put them all in one territory and call it Iraq, right? This was European colonialism at its worst. At least now I am interjecting my 21st century perspective, which I always have to caution others and myself is unfair. It's unfair to do that because it was what was done. Nevertheless, the British and the French carve it up so that the Brits will end up with a mandate to govern in Palestine, and the French will end up with a mandate to govern in places like Syria and Lebanon. Right? And if you know anything about the languages and the culture of the places that I'm talking about, you know that English was a lingua franca alongside Hebrew and Arabic in Palestine, whereas French becomes the lingua franca in places like Lebanon and Syria. So the Jews also decide that they would rather do business with the British than with the French. So the Jews who are living in Palestine at the time think that this is a good thing because they see how colonialism works elsewhere in the world, and they believe, correctly or incorrectly, that under British rule they will have more autonomous decision-making and more freedom of Jewish self-expression than they will under the French. I think they might have also still been very bitter about the Dreyfus case. They have a real distaste for the French, and so the Brits and the Jews decide, or the Jews decide, the Brits are going to be our natural allies. And they appoint as their kind of chief spokesperson a man named Chaim Weizmann, who cut his teeth actually as a leading chemist and won all sorts of distinguished awards for this, for his development of acetone, which is an important ingredient in the naval explosive cordite, which the Brits use in their war effort. So Weizmann has an in with the British government because he, as a chemist, has developed this very important chemical that they need to defeat their enemies in World War I. And he happens along the way, in the course of being feted as this important person who helped to turn the war toward the Brits, he meets a guy named Arthur Balfour, who was an up-and-coming member of the UK, of the British Parliament. And they befriend each other going back to like 1906. This will prove advantageous when, by the end of the war, Balfour finds himself promoted to the role of Foreign Secretary. Right, so and I've skimmed a little bit here. One thing also that happened was that during this time, actually no, let's read the Balfour Declaration. So that's the handout. This is an actual facsimile signed by Arthur James Balfour, who again at the time was serving as the UK's Foreign Secretary, which is why it says Foreign Office, November 2nd, 1917. So now with the British firmly in control of the territory known as Palestine, the British now have a mandate to govern in Palestine, British Mandatory Palestine. This following letter, after much diplomatic massaging led by Chaim Weizmann, is issued as follows. Dear Lord Rothschild, who was, by the way, the same Rothschild who was funding the whole effort. So he was the one who was also in direct negotiations. He didn't write this to Weizmann, but he and Weizmann engineered this petition and its response. I have much pleasure in conveying to you on behalf of His Majesty's government the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the Cabinet. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object. It being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. I should be grateful if you would bring this declaration to the knowledge of the Zionist Federation. Okay, so in sum, what's in the Balfour Declaration? Like, what's important about it? Now, that's not a rhetorical question. As you read it, that's the whole of it, by the way. It's not like, that's not the preamble, that's the Balfour Declaration. It's one page, not even, it's a few sentences. Yeah, Julie. The British are saying there can be a Jewish state in Palestine. Great. What's not in the Balfour Declaration? All right, what are we going to do with the Arabs who are living there, the Palestinian Arabs? It simply says anything that is done should not infringe on their rights and their property. What else does it not say? Where exactly? And Palestine at the time, as defined by all those nice right angles and whatnot, included all of what we think of today as Jordan. So that's really important. If you look at what Palestine meant back then, that means the territory in this part of the world that was being governed under the British mandate, it included all of Jordan. That was the thing I was going to skip to, which is that will not be the case for long. 4 years later, a certain British official, I forget his exact role in the British government at the time, but he was basically charged with redrawing the map. His name was Winston Churchill. You may have heard of him. And he basically redraws the mandate to exclude the area known as Transjordan, which is what we call today Jordan. In other words, this big territory relative to Israel, much larger than the land of Israel itself today, which we today call Jordan, to the east of the Jordan River. So Transjordan on the other side of the Jordan, he says that's going to be all Arab. None of that will be eligible for a future Jewish state. So Churchill is directly responsible for redrawing the map so as to exclude a significant portion of land that early Zionists had thought might be part of the future Zionist state. However, to Jess's very important point, Jesse makes the very important point, it's just not in there. The Balfour Declaration doesn't actually say what part of the land will be a Jewish state. Right? There's no picture, there's no diagram drawn. It simply says the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine. In 1923, more negotiation between the British and the French happens over this territory because they're in charge. And so a very important land agreement is made. There's like a little swap way up in the north. The British agree in a negotiated settlement to give a little territory, very strategically important, in the very northern eastern part of Israel, called the Golan Heights, to the French to govern under the Syrian mandate. And in exchange, the Brits will take the upper Galilee, just south of the Golan and a little bit to the east, as part of Palestine. Just interesting that the French will now govern what we think of as the Golan Heights, which of course was one of the territories captured in war in 1967. Around this time, I'm going back a little bit because you have to kind of like go back and forth to get how all these people converge on this landscape. Post-Balfour, so immediately post-Balfour, a young man who had immigrated to Eretz Yisrael as an ardent young Zionist in 1906, I think as a late teenager, like not even 20 years old, named, born David Gruen, which is David Green, who named himself, like most early Zionists did, in a Hebrew name, David Ben Gurion, had been making his way upward through the ranks of the leadership of the Yishuv, again, the organized settlement of Zionists in Palestine at the time. And before World War I broke out, like in about 1910, 1911, he decided that if he was ever going to be a leader of the Zionist movement in Palestine, he needed to work with the Ottomans, right? Because before World War I, that was the power. So he actually moved to Turkey to study law. He never finished his degree. The war broke out, and he decided, you know what, maybe not. And tides were shifting away from an Ottoman victory toward a British and French victory. He decides, I'm going to move back to Palestine. And he continues to work his way up through Yishuv leadership, eventually establishing his own party called Achdut Avodah, which means the unity of labor, and eventually he becomes secretary of the entire Zionist labor movement. This establishes Ben Gurion by the 1920s as the authoritative voice, the spokesperson for the Yishuv, especially since you consider that the origins of Zionist settlement, you know, Herzl dreamed of a political reality, but Herzl now has been dead for 20 years. I'm thinking like mid-1920s. Avraham Yitzchak Kook, the rabbi who said there can be no Zionism without a religious consciousness, only influenced a small number of people. Very influential voice, but not in terms of the mass population. The dominant Zionist movement of bodies on the ground were labor Zionists. They were people who were committed to the idea of, all right, I guess we're going to take up tools and start farming collectives called kibbutzim. Most of them subscribed to a socialist political identity, so socialism was really their way. This plays into why when the UN 25 years later votes to accept Israel among the community of nations, the USSR votes in favor. They thought that it would be good for communism. Very interesting. It's communism and socialism, not the same thing. And Israel, David Ben Gurion is an avowed anti-communist, but there is definitely a socialist labor ethic, right? That these would be the new masters of their own Jewish destiny in the Promised Land. Okay, I'm going to pause for questions or thoughts at this point before we move on. Yep, Sandy.
Could you explain the word and idea of mandate? The British gave a mandate, but the British also first get a mandate?
Yeah, the British either negotiate or seize upon an opportunity to govern a land that they basically took over when their enemy collapsed during World War I. So the British have an internationally recognized mandate, dictum, authorization, to govern the territory known as Palestine toward the end of World War I. Yeah, I don't know who actually authorized it. Yeah, they worked it out with the French. You know, to the victors go the spoils. The British and the French basically carve up the map. I don't know whether they self-empowered or sought international recognition from the nascent League of Nations, which was established by Woodrow Wilson and basically was kind of a toothless organization. Though, in terms of idea, it was the visionary precursor to the United Nations. Yeah, so, but I don't know exactly who mandated that British would rule, other than that the British and the French agreed upon it.
And then did the British create a mandate that the Jews would have?
No. We'll get there. We'll get there. That's today. How did it come to be independent Jewish rule? We'll get there. Yeah, Jim.
You said that the Nazis really imported the jihadist idea. The question is, what happened with the pogroms of 1921?
We're getting there. We're getting there. That's the next part of my outline. Yep. Mitch.
Behind the scenes
Yeah, not clear exactly what the British were thinking. What most people agree in is that they got in way over their heads with this. Like, what they did not anticipate was how ardently the Zionists were committed to their own statehood and the extent to which they would use force as a means to getting it. Because remember, at this point, there is no Jewish offense. There's only a little bit of Jewish defense. Jews who have emigrated to Palestine at this point realize that in order to protect their farms from theft, in order to protect their property from raids from nearby Arab villages, they need to form some kind of little defense units. But the whole idea was it's just normal citizen defensive action, like these miniature militias, right? They didn't have a lot of armaments, they didn't have an organized military strategy, and they were not trying to displace by force the indigenous peoples there. But when that starts to happen, which is what we're going to get to, the Brits end up way over their heads, which is why I think that they were basically playing a game of total improvisation. Like, I don't think they had a long game in mind. And this was happening, by the way, all over the British Commonwealth. It's the same thing in India, right? Populations in the 1920s through the 1940s and 1950s start to become very restive about the colonial oppression and occupation of indigenous peoples. And ironically, both Jews and Arabs who had claims to this land become restive against the British as the dominant force there. But I don't think that was, I don't think they knew what they were in for. They just, obviously, to be the colonial master of a land, to have a mandate, it's a huge source of resources. Whether they saw oil as a possible, they were wrong about Palestine. But so I don't know. I don't know enough about what the Brits had in mind, but it becomes clear from history that they were way in over their heads. Let's take one more from Eugene. You had a question. Yep. Well, first of all, they're not coming from all over the world. They're coming from Europe, from Western Europe and from Eastern Europe. And they're coming in greater numbers the worse things get in Europe, which means, many tens of thousands every year. So that, I don't have yearly statistics, but you can get it on Wikipedia. Like, you can actually read facsimile ledgers of how many Jews, how many Arabs at any given point. The Jews are significantly outnumbered by Arabs all the way until the War of Independence in the 1948, 1949, right? However, after the war, we find that there are about 600,000 Jews living in the territory and about 165,000 Arabs. Before the war, about 700,000 Arabs to about 300,000 Jews. So over 30 plus years, 300,000 Jews will end up in the Yishuv, in the Zionist settlement. But they're outnumbered 2-to-1 by the Arab population on the eve of the War of Independence. Okay, after World War II. Okay, so let's talk about this. The next whole section of my notes is all about conflict with the Arabs. As aspirational Jewish statehood became the official policy of the British Empire. And remember that Britain is now kind of like high on its horse because they are now among the official victors of World War I. This infuriated the local Palestinian Arabs. And violent conflicts, I think whoever raised their hand, what about conflict with, I think it was Jim, begin starting in the 1920s. Riots break out in 1920 in Jerusalem, where Arabs kill about 6 Jews and wound dozens of others. In 1921, riots break out, instigated by Arabs in Jaffa, that spread to the local areas and leave 4 dozen Jews dead, including the famous Zionist author and intellectual ideologue Yosef Chaim Brenner. And at the same time, remember, Jews had established their own defense leagues going back to the first decade of the 20th century. Originally, in 1909, the local Jewish militias organized into a kind of cohesive-ish group called Hashomer, which means the defense, security. In 1921, Hashomer has grown to the point where the leadership of the Yishuv, especially with Ben Gurion as their main spokesperson, decide we need a unified defense force for all of the Jewish settlement in Palestine, and they call it Haganah. The Haganah like from the Hebrew word magen, like Magen David, or a Magen David, or Magen Avraham ve'ezrat Sarah at the end of the prayer. Magen just means a shield. Haganah means defense, right? So the defense, this of course, the Haganah will become the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, but it is a coalition of local militias starting in 1921. In 1923, Zev Jabotinsky publishes two papers called The Iron Wall and I think Beyond the Iron Wall. And I've actually provided an excerpt on the back of the Balfour Declaration. This, rather than me telling you what Jabotinsky thought, you can read in his own words. Our peacemongers are trying to persuade us that the Arabs are either fools whom we can deceive by masking our real aims, or that they are corrupt and can be bribed to abandon to us their claim to priority in Palestine in return for cultural and economic advantages. I repudiate this conception of the Palestinian Arabs. Culturally, they are 500 years behind us. They have neither our endurance nor our determination. Get the chauvinism of European Jewry there. But they are just as good psychologists as we are. We may tell them whatever we like about the innocence of our aims, watering them down and sweetening them with honeyed words to make them palatable, but they know what we want, as well as we know what they do not want. They feel at least the same instinctive jealous love of Palestine as the old Aztecs felt for ancient Mexico and the Sioux for their rolling prairies. And the fact that a Jew publicly articulated this, by the way, has been used both by the Jews to say, we knew what we were getting into, and by the Arabs who, even to this day, the Palestinians who say the Jews knew exactly what they were up to. They can't play naive that, they came to this empty land with people who would be pacified by our economic or cultural goodwill, right? Come on. It's a real bracing tonic against peacemongers who believe we're all just going to live side by side in peace and harmony. This is 1923. This is 100 years ago. Exactly. Reading on. This does not mean that there cannot be any agreement with the Palestine Arabs. What is impossible is a voluntary agreement. As long as the Arabs feel that there is at least the hope of getting rid of us, they will refuse to give up this hope in return for either kind words or for bread and butter, because they are not a rabble, but a living people. And when a living people yields in matters of such a vital character, it is only when there is no longer any hope of getting rid of us, because they can make no breach in the iron wall. These words are so prescient for 2023, you'll get it, I don't need to articulate that. Not till then will they drop their extremist leaders whose watchword is never, meaning no compromise with the Jews. And the leadership will pass to the moderate groups who will approach us with a proposal that we should both agree to mutual concessions. So this idea is that if we can get rid of the extremists, then there will be hope for compromise. Until then, there will be no compromise. Then we may expect them to discuss honestly practical questions, such as a guarantee against Arab displacement, or equal rights for Arab citizens, which Israel does eventually grant, or Arab national integrity. And when that happens, I am convinced that we Jews will be found ready to give them satisfactory guarantees so that both peoples can live together in peace like good neighbors. Now, these words become the cornerstone of another niche movement within Zionist thought that is conventionally known as revisionist Zionism. It basically is Herzlian in its overall outlook, the absolute necessity of a Jewish polity, a political reality in Palestine, but it is hard-nosed about the aims and the means that will be required to achieve it. And Jabotinsky becomes sort of the spiritual father figure, or the intellectual father figure, for revisionist Zionists, both in Palestine and still in Europe. Founded in Riga, in Latvia, in the right shortly after the publication of these documents, is an organization called Betar. It's not important. I mean, it's a fascinating origin story, but Betar basically says they name themselves in part after a battalion of Jews who fought against the Romans during the Bar Kokhba revolt in the 2nd century. The basic idea of revisionist Zionism is kind of like the difference between, please This is a metaphor, folks. Don't read too much into it. It's my metaphor. So you can tar and feather me for it, but I hope you'll get my meaning. It's a metaphor. It's kind of like the difference between revisionist Zionism and OG Zionism is like the difference between Black Power and Martin Luther King, right? It is a movement that is much more willing to accomplish the aim, which is consistent with Zionism, through any means necessary. The difference between Malcolm X and Martin Luther King is the difference between Vladimir Jabotinsky and his followers and King and his followers, who preached and practiced a message of nonviolent resistance. Jabotinsky preaches a message of, when necessary, violent resistance. Okay. Now, in 1928, Jews decide to erect a temporary mechitza. You know what a mechitza is? Like, if all the women in this room were over here and all the men were over here, because this is a synagogue last time I checked, it's a sanctuary, and we put up a nice little barrier right down the middle, that's a mechitza, okay? They put up a mechitza at the Kotel, at the Western Wall. Again, 1928. You think that what's happening at the Kotel is just new? No, this goes way back. And the Muslim authorities who are in control of the Islamic holy sites on top of what we call the Temple Mount, and what they call Haram al-Sharif, the noble shrine or the noble sanctuary, believe that this is an unwelcome disruption and charge the Jews of antagonizing Muslim people in prayer on top of the Temple Mount. Again, all of the things we're seeing today have their origins. And so the Arab leader who is becoming the dominant voice for the Arab community in Palestine, a guy named Hajj al-Hamin Husseini, who is the mufti, the grand mufti of Jerusalem, the highest religious official for the Muslim community in Jerusalem. He declares to restrict all Jewish activity at the Western Wall, and that, of course, inflames the tensions all the more, and the Jews get angry, and then they begin to spread rumors and use falsified images to show Jews damaging Islamic holy sites. It's like before Photoshop. Before, you could just do deep fakes on the internet, they're sending out these doctored images of Jews allegedly scrawling graffiti on Muslim holy shrines and what have you. In 1929, Arab youths begin to hurl rocks at yeshiva students in Hebron, murdering one. The next morning, they surround the entire Jewish community armed with clubs and knives, axes, and rocks. They ransacked homes, and they offered the community, they round up the local rabbi, and these Arab hooligans offer the rabbi a deal. They say, hand over to us all of the Ashkenazi Jews in Hebron. We'll leave alone the Jews who come from other ancestries, Sephardic, Mizrahi, smaller number, by the way. Give us all the Ashkenazim so we can have our way. The rabbi would not. They killed him. A rampage ensues that kills 133 Jews, 67 in Hebron alone. So for the Jews, this was like another Kishinev. So what's happening is you see that these violent tensions are starting to escalate between the Jews and the Arabs in the territory. And as a response, the Yishuv decides it needs to develop paramilitary capabilities. So it starts sneaking in foreign arms from Europe, and it develops its own munitions factories, which will become a significant part of their later war efforts. Some of you may have even visited the Ayalon Institute, which was a hidden bullet factory underneath a kibbutz, about 30 minutes outside of Tel Aviv by bus. In 1931, a fighting force deeply influenced by Jabotinsky, which is why we had to read parts of the Iron Wall, breaks away from the Haganah to create their own fighting faction. Most of them are members of Bitar, the militant Zionist wing that came from Europe, was established in Latvia in 1923 after Jabotinsky published his paper. Jabotinsky is named the supreme commander of this organization, which is called the Organization, or in Hebrew, the Irgun. Right? And the Irgun, unlike the Haganah, is not committed only to self-defense for the Jews. It is committed to military action that will preemptively protect Jewish communities. But because it is more extreme, it actually amplifies the willingness of both sides to resort to violence to settle their growing disputes. Who becomes the leader of the Irgun? Menachem Begin. I heard someone say it, right? He will go on, we'll learn about this 2 weeks from now and the following week, to become one of the most important statesmen in all of Israel's history. But he's actually a European guy who comes from what is today Belarus, studied law in Warsaw, after which he was influenced by Jabotinsky. He becomes a militant revisionist Zionist, participates in Betar in Europe, and when he finally makes his way to Palestine, not until 1942, by the way, he is already widely known and celebrated and is immediately basically made the head of the Irgun, the head of this militia, this militant faction within the Haganah. And the stories of the descent between the Haganah and the Irgun are legendary. Okay, what happens in Europe around this time? And I'm going quickly through history. It's 1933. Many people think the Holocaust is death camps and gassing Jews and cremating their bodies. It is not. The Holocaust is a 12-year program of Nazi terror and systematic dehumanization of Europe's Jews, which ends with the adoption of the final solution, which is only after the Nazis had already been using roving killing bands of Nazi thugs to mount trucks and travel to distant villages and communities wherever Jews were throughout Europe, round up all of the town's Jews, hang their leaders in the public square or shoot them, make them dig mass graves and shoot all of them, sometimes by the thousands or even tens of thousands, like in the largest of such massacres, which was at Babi Yar, outside of Kyiv, in what is today Ukraine. The Holocaust, of course, has made the situation dire for all of European Jewry, even in the 1930s. It also amplifies the desperation of the Yishuv, the Zionist settlement, and their leaders to push harder for real progress on the political front. So what does the Yishuv, its number one tool is not actually armed resistance. Its number one tool is pushing the British for immigration, to open up the floodgates, to allow the Jews of Europe, now under Nazi rule, to come to Palestine. However, Arab resistance is also mounting. And the Arabs also have the ear of the British. And the Arabs convince the British that allowing more Jews to emigrate to Palestine is only going to make an administrative and technical and military nightmare for the British, right? So this is very much related to your question, Mitch. Like, the Brits are way in over their heads already, and it's only 1936. And they decide to placate the Arabs. I mean, you can say it was a policy of appeasement. In the mid to late 1930s, the Brits were really good with policies of appeasement, right? You may have heard of Munich and Chamberlain. That's happening at the same time. And the Brits decide that the best way they can control the situation in Palestine is not to make it worse by letting more Jews come in. Of course, from the Jewish perspective, this is a nightmare. It's a total nightmare. And so, in response, by the way, further pushing the Brits to restrict immigration, Arabs revolt to even small amounts of Jewish settlement, and increasing violence and then Jewish reprisal attacks are mounting. The British even try to send in more troops to put down these insurrections and little skirmishes, and they find that their soldiers are being targeted both by Jews and by Arabs. So for the Brits, this is a total mess. So what do? They publish a paper infamously known as the White Paper in 1939. Remember, this is right before Hitler invades Poland. The British declare, we're going to severely restrict Jewish immigration to Palestine. Right? For the Jews, this is an absolute nightmare. And I'm skipping a little bit. This was actually after a commission had been set up by the British called the Peel Commission to investigate the problem. Long story short, over these 3 years, 1936 to 1939, the Brits are recommending restricting immigration. They say, we'll allow, I think the Peel Commission said, or the White Paper says, we'll allow 75,000 Jews to come to Palestine over the next 5 years. So from 1939 to 1944, 75,000 Jews. Now, you know how many Jews were murdered in the Shoah. So 75,000 Jews. Biden raised the cap last year on refugees to the United States to 100,000, which is still lower than the historical average for the United States. Now, the United States is a much bigger place than British mandatory Palestine. Nevertheless, 75,000 refugee Jews from the Nazis is nothing, did nothing to help us. The Arabs protested the White Paper. They said, this will still favor the Jews. right? 75,000, if they have babies, this is going to endanger our communities, our lives, our livelihoods, our families. We don't like this at all. They rejected it. Jews, of course, were worried that this will cause Jews to be trapped in Europe, leading to their certain death. Shortly thereafter, Germany invades Poland. So now Britain is officially an allied power against the Nazis. Ben-Gurion makes one of his most famous statements in his entire political career. He says, "We will fight with the British against Hitler as if there were no white paper," that's the document restricting immigration, "and we will fight the white paper as if there were no war." Right? So they have a two-pronged approach. We will support the British against the Nazis, but we will fight the British against their restrictive immigration policies vis-a-vis the Jews of Palestine. Some followers of Jabotinsky, associated with the Irgun, decide that the best thing they can do to move the needle is to organize campaigns of what their opponents would call terrorism, and what those who favor them would call militantism. Who knows? I mean, they were bombing British strategic installations. The Yishuv begins to endorse illegal immigration against the British mandate. These immigrants who bravely make their way to Palestine are called ma'apilim, so they're immigrants who defy the law. The most famous story, you probably know this, is the doomed voyage of a ship named the St. Louis. We're getting to the Exodus later. So yeah, more than one doomed ship for Jews in this time. This was a ship bound from Hamburg to Cuba with almost 1,000 Jewish passengers on board. When they get to Cuba, the Cuban president refuses entry to their ports, won't let them disembark. The ship captain, who was a Dutchman, tried mightily to find a home for each and every one of the passengers. He had to turn back to Europe to do that. Eventually, a couple hundred or less of the Jewish refugees who were aboard the St. Louis find themselves in Holland, France, Great Britain, and Belgium, all of whom took them in and did what they could to protect them. Another 254 had to disembark in Nazi-occupied Europe and died in the Shoah. So yeah, the story of the St. Louis is still told as an example of what the Jews were up against at this point. The Brits continue to maintain the White Paper's restrictions on immigrations throughout World War II, even as the situation was beyond dire for Europe's Jews. The more militant wing, the Irgun, thinks that the Haganah is not willing enough to use force and violence to accomplish its aims, so another splinter group forms. Anyone know what they're called? Yeah, we call them, though apparently this is disparaging, we call them the Stern Gang, or the Stern Gang, is led by a guy named Avraham Stern, who was an author and he wrote erotic poetry. He's a really interesting guy. Erotic poetry about the land of Israel. But it's really salacious, it's really interesting stuff. He basically creates this group called Lochamei Cherut Yisrael, Fighters for the Freedom of Israel, or Lechi, which also means your cheek, but that's not what it meant. Lechi also means to go forth. So Lechi is the most militant wing of anyone fighting for the Jewish settlement. It's crazy. Like, there was just no unified approach. This was so ragtag, and one of the things that made Ben-Gurion furious was every time one of these more militant groups would go out and take matters into their own hands to turn the tide of war. How much time do I have? Ooh, 10.5 minutes. Yeah, why not? I think we can do this. Okay, let me give you an example of what Ben-Gurion does in response. So, we have to skip a little bit of history. The Allied forces win the war. It's now the summer of 1946. You probably can imagine the situation that there are hundreds of thousands of Jews who are still in DP camps who want to come to Palestine. And the Brits, who still have the mandate to govern, even though they are increasingly under fire from both the Jews and the Arabs, continue to maintain restrictive positions on Jewish immigration to Palestine. Ben-Gurion organizes all of these infighting factions of his various militias under something called the United Resistance Movement. And they, in the summer of 1946, coordinate 11 attacks on roadways and rail bridges, and they block Britain's ability to move goods and soldiers and cost Britain some $4 million, some exorbitant sum of money. The Brits retaliate 12 days later, late June 1946, with something called Operation Agatha, though it's known as Black Shabbat, Shabbat HaShachor, or Black Sabbath, by the Jews, in which they locked down all of the major Jewish cities in Palestine, and British soldiers went searching and seizing militants and arms. They rounded up over 2,700 Jews at the time. Ben-Gurion only escaped arrest because he was in Paris at the time doing diplomacy. So it's really amazing. Like, you have to understand, again, I just think the Brits got in so way over their head with the mandate, which leads them actually not to give the Jews a mandate to govern, but just to say, we're done, we're out. That's what ends up happening, which of course creates a massive power vacuum that leads to even worse outcomes for some. Okay. Skipping. All right, here's an example, another example of what was going on. In 1947, a vessel carrying over 4,500 passengers, all of them, mostly all of them Holocaust survivors, known as the Exodus, there you go, Susan, was the largest such vessel, but there were many like this, attempting to get a few 100,000 displaced persons, mostly Holocaust survivors, out of Europe. Because what was happening in Europe at the time, first of all, you don't want to be a displaced person in a refugee camp. You'll die of typhoid. It's a miserable life. And Europe doesn't want this problem on its hands. However, there is literally no place for them to go. The United States also had restrictive immigration against Jews. They still were holding the story of the St. Louis. So the Jews who want to go to Palestine are especially motivated by the fact that the handfuls of Jews who tried to resettle in their home communities, especially in Poland, were being murdered by virulently anti-Semitic mobs. So pogroms were still breaking out against Jewish communities in Europe. Even after 6 million of our people were murdered by the Nazis, thousands and thousands more were murdered by ordinary Poles after the war was over. We're going to see a movie this winter called 1945, which is one of 3 movies that I'm sponsoring as part of our midwinter movie series. That one's a must-see. They're all a must-see. Watch your bulletin. We've got 3 fun movies on various Sundays in January and February. Okay. Yeah, it's really fun. It's a real... No, we're also watching Crossing Delancey and The Fabelmans, but we're watching a Hungarian black and white film called 1945 that is searing. You must watch it. Okay. Most of the passengers on the Exodus, or the Exodus 1947, as it was fully called, were Holocaust survivors. They had no legal immigration certificates to Palestine. When they dock, the Royal Navy boards her, actually even before they dock, in international waters outside of Haifa, took the passengers, takes the boat to Haifa, and then ships were waiting to take the passengers off and put them back in refugee camps in Europe, which is what happened to most of them. Right, so I'm going to get to the end here now as quickly as humanly possible. We'll probably have to pick up next time, and that's okay. Yeah, we'll do the war next time, but let me just say a couple of facts and statistics. In 1945, in April, as the war was nearing its close, the United Nations was formed and sworn in. So in 1947, you have to understand the UN is only 2 years old. And they created in 1947 a special committee on Palestine. The UN Special Committee on Palestine, usually abbreviated just UNSCOP, UNSCOP, which is composed of representatives from 11 countries that are all tasked with finding a solution for Palestine, which is something the British had just not been willing or able to do. The Arabs immediately announced that they are boycotting all UNSCOP meetings. They're not going to participate, meaning the Arabs of Palestine. They will send no representation. UNSCOP spends the whole summer of 1947 studying the situation and investigating, and in September of 1947, they propose a UN partition plan. Now, you may be familiar with this. The area designated for the Jews is going to be about 55% of the territory, with 45 for the Arabs. This actually is considerably larger than what had been proposed more than 10 years earlier by the Peel Commission, which was set up to investigate the city. They also proposed a partition where the Jews would get about 80% of the land and the Arabs would get, where the Jews would get about 20% of the land and the Arabs would get 80. The Arabs have turned down these opportunities to partition the land every time. UNSCOP proposes its partition plan. It's interesting, by land it would have been 55% for the Jews and 45% by land mass for the Arabs. By population, not exactly. The Jewish state would have had about 500,000 Jews and 400,000 Arabs. And the Arab state would have had about 725,000 Arabs and 10,000 Jews. This was an unacceptable compromise for the Arabs. The Jews said, we'll take it. The plan had support from the Yishuv, from the Zionist leadership, also from the US, also from the British, also from the Soviets. Again, as I said, they thought that a Jewish state would actually be good for communism, which is kind of a wild conclusion. On November 29th, 1947, after 2 months of wrangling, the UN passes the partition plan by a majority of 7 countries out of the 11. And the Yishuv knew that as soon as that happened, war would break out. And that's what we're going to pick up in 2 weeks' time. We're going to talk a little bit about what the war looked like. The war is actually fought in 2 stages, and it's a war on multiple fronts that begins with an internal civil war. When I say civil, I mean within the borders of Palestine, between the Jewish population and the Arab population, and against the British, who were, you could call them, the governing force. At this point, they are viewed both by Jews and Arabs as an occupying force. They're occupying the people who both have national aspirations. That's the first phase of the war, during which, in May of 1948, Israel declares its independence. After Israel declares its independence, it becomes internationalized, with the surrounding Arab countries joining the internal Arab forces against the Jews in a collective effort to displace Jews and erase or eradicate the newly declared Jewish state. So that's too much in my notes to try and take up in 4.5 minutes. So let's leave the remaining 5 minutes of our class, since we do start right on time, and I do want to end right on time. And I can stay for a few minutes afterward if people have questions. I have a bar mitzvah family at 1:30. But between now and 1:15, let's try and take some questions, and I'll do my best. Again, a lot of this is information that I've had to relearn in a very, very short amount of time. So I'll do my best. Ruth. It's a really good question. Like, I don't, but no, a lot has been written on this. I mean, through hindsight, Palestinians today retroject onto their history their own present-day national identity. What you're really, and that's not unreasonable, by the way. Like, we retroject onto the 13 colonies a sense of American unified objectives. That is completely not the case, right? Just look at the congressional congresses, or the constitutional conventions, and the amount of arguing among the colonies about really important fundamental matters of American identity. Who would we be, right? States saw themselves, or colonies saw themselves as colonies, individual. Only later does an American identity coalesce, largely because they had to fight as one. And I think that's, it is probably safe to say that by the end of the war for independence, the Palestinian Arabs had developed a more than embryonic sense of national identity against the Zionists. Right? It was forged in the crucible of Zionist settlement and their resistance to it, often violent resistance, as I've tried to give you a little bit of pictures today. That often Arabs would instigate small-scale violence or larger-scale violence against Jews. And by the way, one of the things we'll learn next week, or 2 weeks from now, since we're not doing this Sunday of Thanksgiving weekend, we're coming back on December 3rd, and we have another class on the 10th. Do my best to get it all in by then. If not, we'll keep learning later on this year. There's more to study, of course. I think that during the war, Arabs today, again, or Palestinians today, have a deep record of grievance against the Zionists, against the Jews, for perpetrating what they have recorded as massacres against Arab populations and the mass displacement of Arab people from Palestine to either the disputed territories of the West Bank and Gaza today or other countries where they were not really welcomed. So the statelessness of the Palestinian people today, I think today they retroject back onto what they experienced in the pre-state years leading up to and including the war for independence. At the time, did they see themselves as a nation fighting for independent statehood? Not evidently. I mean, the fact that they refused every opportunity to actually have an internationally recognized state according to the terms of the Peel Commission and the UN, and that's just by 1948, to say nothing of later negotiated peace attempts at peace agreements between the Israelis and the Palestinians, signals that their objective, at least for a significant time, was not statehood. It was eradication of the Zionist interloper, right? The occupier. So a lot of this, and again, what Palestinians mean when they talk about occupation, it's really complicated. Israelis use that word too, by the way, but I think that we're talking about two very different things. Or Israelis and Palestinians are talking about two very different things. When Israelis who use the word occupation, and not all Israelis are willing to use the word, they almost invariably are talking about the situation of Palestinians living in the West Bank post-1967. Whereas when Palestinians use the word occupation, many, if not all, are referring to the condition of Jews being in the land, any of it, hence from the river to the sea, right? So you ask a Palestinian, what's occupied? And you will not get a consistent answer, but many Palestinians believe that the original occupation started with Zionist settlement pre-state and was made a fact on the ground with the UN in 1948. But again, it's really hard to get inside of a national identity at the time it's happening because all we have is the history as written. And I've done my best to sort this out by reading so many different perspectives, so I'm just really here to educate. But you know, obviously you'll know where my biases are. None of us are free from biases. Ken?
Were there ever any constructive discussions between the Jews and the Arabs, or any reason to think that they could work this out without big war?
Pre-1948, not really. And you know, the de facto Arab spokesperson is this Hajj Al-Amin Husseini, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. I alluded to this and didn't get into it because it's actually part of next week, but as early as 1941, I think, he actually, I should have gotten into this. After the Peel Commission is set up in the late 1930s and the Brits recommend partition for the first time, Hajj Amin al-Husseini says, no way. We won't talk, we won't negotiate, we won't compromise. And that, by the way, has, the word no has been a very powerful word in Arab and Palestinian vocabularies throughout the 20th century. It is their dominant position is, we will not negotiate, because to negotiate legitimates it accepts the reality of a Jewish state in Palestine. Hajj Amin al-Husseini is exiled from Palestine in the late 1930s by the British because he's such a troublemaker and rabble-rouser and incites violence. So where does he go to? He finds refuge in Berlin in 1939, and actually has an audience with Hitler, I think in 1940 or 1941, I think. And basically, he comes up with a informal alliance, and he basically pledges the support of Palestine's Arabs in the Nazi war effort. So we'll join you in your victory, because that will be good for us. And this is where he takes back one of the things he learned from his time as a refugee from Palestine in Berlin is Nazi anti-Semitic propaganda, which he brings back to use as part of the Arab campaign against the Jews. So many of the most insidious and violent lies or hostile lies against the Jewish people that led directly or that had an influential role in the Shoah, in the extermination of the attempted extermination of the Jewish people, and that persists throughout the world today, were actually a Nazi export to the Middle East during the war. Yeah, that's why I said, by the way, like Jews of Muslim lands throughout most of history fared pretty well, but you don't want to be a Jew in a Muslim majority land today, with a few exceptions. I have Jewish friends who are living in Indonesia right now. It's actually, by population, the largest Muslim majority country in the world. And it is largely de-radicalized. It is not an Arab, it was untouched. But because it's Indonesia, by the way, the geography doesn't favor the influx of Nazi-style jihadist propaganda. It has its own jihadist problem. Most countries have a jihadist problem. Other questions? Maybe one more, Lenny? And then we have to stop. Of course, delighted to do this. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. I'm glad there's no test, too.
So in 1917, the British allowed the state of the Jews.
Yeah, they say, we're going to support the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine.
My timeline is correct. Why did they then restrict the number of immigrants that come in?
Yeah, it's really interesting. They say you can have a state, but in the 1923, starting in the 1920s, the early 20s, when violence breaks out between Arabs and Jews, again, I think the British, finding themselves in over their heads, the last thing the British are inclined to do is give self-sovereignty, including military sovereignty, over to a bunch of people who are apt to perpetrate acts that they would have categorized as illegal terror. Right, so it was not in Britain's interest to let go of this territory quite so soon. And the other thing, when I asked what's not in the Balfour Declaration, you correctly answered where exactly. You also, we as a class, failed to say when exactly. It doesn't actually propose a timeline. And so, yes, much has been made over the fact that Jews used legal means to secure their Zionist enterprise in the land of Palestine, but it should not be underestimated that we used illegal means as well. Yes, we purchased land legally from the Ottomans. We set up the Jewish National Fund to buy the land fair and square. We established, we followed immigration practices legally, but we also, organized militias that sometimes would resist the Brits with violence. We perpetrated acts of illegal immigration. The more restrictive immigration became, the more we resisted it as Jews. So, we were not all like just complacent, law-abiding citizens. And part of that was also, you have to understand, going back to what we learned last week, a lot of that was about the creation of a new Jew who would not sit complacently by while we were getting murdered in our villages in Russia, who would not just sit bent over a prayer book or a Torah and saying, God save us, God save us, God save us. This was a Jew who, even if you weren't a Jabotinsky follower, even if you did not accept by any means necessary taking up arms, right? Many who were invested in the Zionist enterprise were already saying never again. They weren't saying never again to the Shoah, they were saying never again to Kishinev and to Dreyfus and to 1,000 years of institutionalized state and church-sponsored anti-Semitism. They said, not here, not now. And so their resistance to the British grew and grew and grew, which further disinclined the British to give them the rights to self-govern. So they would have to take it.
Also, prior to 1970, Arabs and Jews lived in Palestine.
Correct.
Was there any conflict?
Skirmishes. And there was also interesting examples of cooperation. Like you have interesting examples of Jewish and Palestinian or Palestinian Arab farmers planting orange groves together. And I think it led to the kind of, there were some early Zionist thinkers and writers who basically were blithely ignorant of their Arab neighbors. There were some who were very disparaging. Even Jabotinsky, while saying there are real people with real aspirations, also said they are culturally 500 years behind us. Imagine you're an Arab reading that, right? You can only be wounded by that. And culturally, Arabs have done a very good job of nursing wounds over the course of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years so that these things become even more prominent in their collective consciousness, right? These are slight after slight after slight of being treated like primitives and savages, largely because the European Zionists thought of them as primitives and savages. Right? They're not wrong to think that. So are there examples of Jewish-Arab violent skirmishes? Not so much. Not so much. But as population grows, as proximity becomes closer and closer, more and more. Thanks, folks. Have a wonderful week. Happy Thanksgiving.